This is, bar none, the worst executed mechanic in Magic's history. Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. This time, I'm going to be covering a rule stunt that came up involving the new prepare mechanic. As the title suggests, we're going to try to create a game state where a creature on the battlefield is prepared, i.e. it has the prepared designation, but there's no spell that it can cast. So to do this, let's say Amy plays a Studious First Year. This card has an ability that makes it enter prepared, so this means that the creature will have the prepared designation on the battlefield. Gaining this designation causes Amy to create a copy of the card Rampant Growth in the exile zone. Next, we'll say that Amy uses Cytoshape to make her Studious First Year a copy of a Grizzly Bears. Only permanents with a Prepare spell can gain the Prepared designation, but the rules don't say that these are the only ones that can have that designation. Now, the situation that we're considering highlights that distinction. Even though Studious First Year is now a copy of a mundane, non-preparation creature, it still counts as being prepared. If Amy wanted to, she could still cast the Rampant Growth right now, and that would work entirely normally. But instead, let's say that Amy uses the Pandorica to phase Studious First Year out while it's prepared. The copy of Rampant Growth remains in exile for as long as Studious First Year remains on the battlefield with the prepared designation. Although phasing out does not constitute a zone change, it does mean that Studious First Year is treated as though it doesn't exist, except for rules and effects that specifically mention phasing. Therefore, after this happens, the Rampant Growth copy ceases to exist the next time state-based actions are performed because the game is pretending Studious First Year doesn't exist. Now, if Amy then untaps or destroys the Pandorica later this turn, that'll cause her creature to phase back in. Now, here's another fun fact about phasing. It does not count as a zone change or otherwise reset the affected permanent's condition in any way. Any continuous effects that were acting on the permanent as it phases out will still apply to it after it phases back in, given that their duration hasn't expired. Therefore, Studious First Year phases back in with the characteristics of Grizzly Bears. Now, as a permanent with a Prepare spell phases in Prepared, you get to create a copy of that Prepare spell. There's just one problem. When the rules talk about a permanent with a Prepare spell, it means a permanent for which the alternative characteristics detailed in the inset card frame exist. Unfortunately, the existence of these characteristics is part of an object's copyable values, meaning that officially, a permanent with a Prepare spell has not phased in Prepared. Therefore, no copy of the Prepare spell is created in exile. After the Cytoshape effect wears off, Amy will control a normal, prepared, Studious First Year, but there will be no copy of a card in exile that she can cast. There's no normal way that she could get one either. Amy would have to somehow remove the Prepared designation from her creature and then re-give it to. But, that is possible, but it would involve a similar amount of hoop jumping as what we just had in the situation to make it come up in the first place. Another wacky trick is that if Amy did the same play, except she Cytoshaped her Studious First Year into a different creature that does have a Prepare spell, like maybe these Huntrix wannabes, well, the game would indeed see a permanent with a Prepare spell phasing in and create a brainstorm. I couldn't think of a way to end up with two discrete Prepare spells associated with the same permanent, but I wouldn't say that's out of the question that someone could figure out a way to do that too. Now, the patron who suggested this question also had a couple really stimulating follow-ups related to how this would be handled in a live event. For example, whether it would be appropriate to physically identify the Studious First Year as being prepared. And the answer is, whatever you want is fine as long as both players understand the game state. This is the same philosophy that explains why there's not yet a standardized way to represent whether any given creature is prepared or not. As long as there's some physical method used to communicate this information, judges really don't care whether it's done with a die or a card sleeve or a glass bead or by covering the Prepare spell with a piece of paper. Whatever you want, as long as it's hard to accidentally change and everyone in the game understands what it means. Another question raised is whether it would be appropriate to issue a penalty to Amy if she followed the reminder text and attempted to cast a copy of Rampant Growth that didn't exist. And this one is pretty easy. I would say that a disqualification for cheating, or at least a warning for unsporting conduct minor, would be appropriate. The reason is that there's no possibility this sort of thing ever would come up in organic gameplay. If this ever did happen, you know darn sure that Amy knew how this trick worked and went through all that nonsense just to troll people, which, yes, would constitute taking an action that's disruptive to the tournament. To me, the much more interesting question is how we got here in the first place. And for the answer, I think we can all point our fingers pretty squarely at the Prepare mechanic. This is, bar none, the worst executed mechanic in Magic's history. Now, I know that's a bold claim, and unlike some other YouTubers, I don't make claims like that 2 to 3 times a week. I really do mean this one. So let me first be clear exactly what I'm saying. When I say worst executed, I'm not talking about stuff like Storm and Dredge. These were reasonable ideas for mechanics that proved to be inherently unbalanced. The failure was on the playtesters, who didn't foresee how strongly these interacted with existing cards and strategies, and how limiting they would be in terms of making new ones. Nor am I talking about stuff like Mutate, which probably only saw the light of day because we're past the era where the rules team had the authority to nix something on the basis that it'll be too complex to implement. I rather think they did a reasonable job of executing an overly ambitious vision. I'm not even talking about stuff like stickers, which were an idiotic idea from the very start, and the various rules and practical issues associated with them stem from the single root cause of Marrow's foolhardy insistence on putting silver-bordered mechanics in black-bordered Magic. Now, when I say the prepare mechanic was poorly executed, what I mean is that the rules framework for preparation cards is unnecessarily complicated, which naturally leads to weird, unnatural scenarios like the one discussed previously. When Magic designers create a new mechanic, they colloquially design how it works and come up with answers to the most common questions about how it interacts with existing cards and mechanics. The design team might or might not have a high enough technical understanding of the comprehensive rules to translate that information into a card template or CR entry that rigorously defines how the mechanic works within the existing rules framework. This job therefore falls on the rules team. Now, this is similar to how the author of a book might hire an editor to review a manuscript and make sure the spelling, grammar, and styling used conform to established norms. I talked about this in my video on theoretical and philosophical aspects of templating, but one of the biggest rules in that area is that simpler is better than complex. Duh. Unfortunately, other goals of Magic sometimes conflict with this, and the templators need to choose what to prioritize. Take a look at the original Mox Diamond and compare it with the one with updated wording. Obviously, the OG makes it much easier to intuitively understand what the top ability is supposed to do, but there's a problem. In Magic, the word win means something is a triggered ability, and triggered abilities go on the stack and can be responded to. As written, it would be possible to play a Mox Diamond and tap it for mana without having to discard a land. So let's take a look at the prepare mechanic through that lens. What do you think? Was this the simplest way to implement a mechanic where a creature knows a spell and can cast it for you? Of course not. Here's the first idea that came to my mind, but of course this one isn't very good. There's a few issues, but the most glaring is that there's no obvious way to accommodate the cards that can re-prepare themselves. Now here's another attempt, I'd say much simpler, and it's probably about 80% of the way there. One problem is that you could unprepare it with something like a Vampire Hexmage. The bigger problem is that this doesn't count as casting a spell, meaning that you can't counter it the way you could a real Rampant Growth. Now, this is confusing, but more than that, it doesn't execute the vision of the mechanic. These creatures are supposed to be casting a spell for you. If it doesn't officially count as casting a spell in game, that totally breaks the fantasy. Some people are probably out there wondering why this issue is worth worrying about in the first place, but Templators are constrained by non-gameplay related reasons more often than you might think. For example, I'm sure they would have loved to say, when Optimus Prime dies, return it to the battlefield transformed. But the lawyers said no, and thus we got an entirely new mechanic which is identical to transform, but for some reason making it a different word changes things. Or, to try a less asinine example, the Chroma mechanic from Eventide was utterly forgettable, but when they reskinned it as Devotion and gave players an intuitive reason why the mana symbols and the mana cost of your permanents would increase the effects you got, the mechanic got much more popular. So anyway, this is how I would have executed the prepare mechanic. If you're thinking it looks familiar, well, that's because it is. It's exactly the same as the Studious first year that actually got printed, but the change I would make is in the CR. Rather than creating a phantom copy as the creature gets prepared, I would allow players to cast a spell matching the prepare spell's characteristics from outside the game. This recovers 99% of the functionality of the actual prepare mechanic while using existing rule structures pioneered by Garth One-Eye rather than creating whole new ones, while at the same time fixing the core issue with the current functionality, i.e. its needless complexity. Creating a copy that requires a special exemption in the state-based actions to maintain its existence, and then coupling your ability to cast that spell to both the prepared designation and the existence of the copy, while also creating rules that make it obvious that the copy is supposed to exist if and only if the creature is prepared? Why? The use of technical terms like stack and object make it clear that the comprehensive rules were originally written by someone with a computer science background. So for fun, the programmers in the audience can earn some nerd cred by totaling up how many fundamental principles of good code just got broken here. And the ironic thing is that maybe the computer programmers are the reason we're in this spot in the first place. The most credible reason that I've heard for why the prepare mechanic was executed the way it was that they wanted there to be a physical card that showed up in Arena so that you could be reminded of it. I don't find this explanation particularly compelling because there are many examples of Arena representing things that aren't technically correct, so why would this one be special? For example, damaging a creature doesn't actually reduce its toughness, but try telling that to someone who's only played on Arena. Some people might be thinking that it's got something to do with gameplay. Like maybe Wizards wanted to have the copy exist independently to force players to have a physical way to communicate the prepared condition. Now that theory makes some sense, but the conversations I've had with experienced judges who told me about the discussions that took place regarding how prepare cards should be represented at the Pro Tour lead me to believe that this thinking was not part of the decision. My first impulse on seeing the entry for preparation cards in the CR was to wonder what they gained from the convoluted solution that the rules team implemented, and to this day, I haven't got a good answer to that. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Thank you again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.